I think that what might be going on here is that psychopathy could be a zombie idea. So the serial killers are often a theme that is brought up, which is actually not very accurate because most serial killers do not fit the psychopathy criteria is a common myth. Probably a little bit more than 100 of these different types of studies, empathy studies, emotion studies, moral, psychological studies, and so on. And we have just never been able to really identify these extreme difficulties that people like Benjamin Rush and Robert Hare eventually talked about. We should stop using this, and we simply just a full stop. That would be my best recommendation. Like, stop using psychopathy in the legal system.
Hi everyone, and welcome to CogIllusions. Today I'm joined by Professor Rasmus Rosenberg Larsen. He's an assistant professor of forensic epistemology and philosophy of science at the University of Toronto, and an affiliated scientist at the National Center for Ontological Research. In this conversation, we will explore the topic of psychopathy. I recently came across an article by Professor Larsen where he suggests that psychopathy might be a zombie idea, and I find it really interesting. So I thought it would be great to talk about it. So thank you very much for being here, Professor Larsen.
Thank you, Fabio. Thanks for the invitation, and looking forward to the conversation.
Okay, so I want to start our conversation from the very basics. What is psychopathy? What is supposed to be? Can you tell us something about it?
Yeah, sure. So psychopathy is generally considered to be, a categorical label for a specific personality disorder. This personality disorder is usually defined by like a chronic pattern of antisocial behavior, and then also usually associated with very shallow and low emotions, and in general a carelessness for people and other people in general, and society also more generally, I suppose. The general idea is that there are individuals in our society who do very unsavory and bad things. They are antisocial, but there are also some cognitive deficits in terms of their capacity to kind of like emotionally resonate with other people, and therefore they're very callous and very careless, fundamentally speaking. So psychopathy is a label supposed to capture that observation or that thing, and psychiatrists generally believe that this is also qualifying as a personality disorder, or as a type of personality disorder. I should say that there's a little bit of disagreement among researchers whether that is the case, but we don't have to go down that stream right here, I think.
Sure. Can you tell us how it is usually measured? Because there are some scales that are used to measure it. I have one in mind. Can you tell us something about it?
Overall, of course, there is a definition in our diagnostic manuals of the general description that I just gave you here, but there's also like often we call these assessment tools that clinicians will use when they sit down with a person and want to make a determination, a clinical determination of whether they are also psychopathic, right? The most popular version is the Hare Psychopathy Checklist Revised. That's a long name, but it goes with the acronym, the PCLR. There's different subversions of this scale, but that is the main scale that people use, especially in clinical and forensic settings. There are other scales that are used mostly in research settings, which are self-report based, but the PCLR is a clinical instrument, meaning that you use it during what you do is that you sit down with the person that you want to assess, and then you interview them, and you also look through their file records and their past history and so on, and you try to make a determination in terms of 20 items on the list. So the checklist consists of 20 items, and they are, they includes questions such as, does the person lack empathy? Does the person lack remorse? Do they have shallow emotions? Do they have a criminal history? And so on. And eventually you will score these 20 items, and it will yield a score from 0 to 40. So 0 points if the item is not present in the person, 1 point if it's somewhat present, and 2 points if it is present. So 20 times 2 point, maximum score of 40, right? And clinically, we generally believe that once you score above 30 or something like that, there's not a strict threshold, but there's some convention that once you score above 30, then that's when clinicians will start to say that we can probably diagnose you with psychopathy at this stage, right? That's the consensus.
That's very clear. Thank you. Another definitional thing that I wanted to ask is like the difference between psychopathy and sociopathy. Sociopathy is a concept that I hear more about in pop psychology, not really in the mainstream scientific community. But can you tell us something about this distinction?
Yeah, of course. So there are generally actually 3 terms that are kind of thrown around a little bit and often need to change. I believe some people try to tell you a story that they're really different things and so on. But these are psychopathy, and as you correctly noticed, also sociopathy. So a psychopath and a sociopath, right? But then there's also the third term, antisocial personality disorder. These 3 concepts are often talked about in like at the same time, often conflated and so on. The history behind these concepts, there's a lot of shared history. So we can try to like take them from the opposite order. So if you go to the diagnostic manuals that a lot of North American psychologists specifically and psychiatrists are using, is the DSM, the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders, which is in its 5th edition. That manual includes a diagnosis called antisocial personality disorder. And it is generally believed that psychopathy is a synonym for antisocial personality disorder, or that psychopathy is a specific subtype of antisocial personality disorder. And so the DSM is a little bit ambiguous on this, but it has like some elaborations on like an alternative approach, they call it, to assessing personality disorder. And here they kind of specify that psychopathy is a subtype of antisocial personality disorder. Now, so these are to people who are not in clinical psychology or psychiatry. This can sound very like technical and kind of like a minimal, like unimportant note, and in many ways it really is, right? So these are just like technical diagnostic language. Now, the term sociopathy, it's really also has a lot of confusions around it. But historically, it was actually just what happened historically was that researchers got rid of the name psychopathy and replaced it with sociopathy. That happened sometime around the 60s and 70s and 80s. And then sociopathy was removed and replaced with antisocial personality disorder. And then what happened is also the next level of complexity here is that around that time, the separate research field for psychopathy kind of exploded. So the term sociopathy was actually just a synonym that was introduced, and then it was kind of gotten rid of. And today, clinicians don't use it. It's just not a term that is being used now. people who are listening here might have heard it and seen it on, TikTok and Instagram, and people, it's not a clinical term we use. It's an outdated term. You can't diagnose a person with sociopathy, for example. It's just not something we do, right? But it's also, it kind of like lives on in popular culture, I think. We also see people using it as an adjective, what a sociopath, right? And which is just like you could have said, what a jerk, right? Like, it's kind of like what you're saying, right? I hear like there's a little bit of, it's almost like a myth, or like, I don't even know how to do, like, the confusion, I suppose. I see a lot of lay people saying, no, the difference between a psychopath and a sociopath is that sociopaths or psychopaths, they don't have empathy. They don't have the capacity to empathy, for example. But sociopaths don't, but they just decide not to use it, or they don't care, or something like that. And it's such a confusing, what the heck does that even mean? Like, everybody is a sociopath then on that definition, because we all have the capacity maybe for empathy, but we exert it very selectively, right? We don't like have deep empathy with any person that we come in contact with, right? So all these are like kind of like these like really really weird narratives that exist out there. Sorry, that was a long explanation. Something is probably a little bit simple.
No, that was a very nice explanation, very exhaustive, and I think it is important because uh, in pop psychology, general culture, there are a lot of confusions. They use the terms in ways that are very different from the ones that people in the scientific community use them.
Yeah,
So it's very important for me to uh, make these distinctions.
sure.
So now that the stage is set, uh, we can start to talk a little bit more in details about this concept. In your recent Eon article, you write that virtually everything that we know about psychopathy has been debunked. And so now I'd like to go through some of the common claims about psychopathy and get your take. One very common belief is this psychopathic individuals are extremely dangerous.
Yes.
How well supported is this claim?
Yeah, so the link between psychopathy and dangerousness, or risk to society, or whatever you want to characterize it, that has been studied quite extensively. So I just want to like give the listeners just a quick overview of what it means to say that we have studied this. So of course, it means that we have involved some real people in our studies. And the real people we have involved are the people that have been diagnosed with psychopathy, right? So of course, if you want to say that psychopaths or psychopathic persons are very dangerous, that is an empirical claim, right? So what we want to do is, when we want to go and study individuals with this diagnosis and measure in some way or the other whether they are more dangerous compared to people who do not have this disorder, right? Now, the one way to go about with this, there's of course multiple ways you can go about with this, but the way that psychologists have started these or conducted these studies is that they typically go into correctional facilities such as prisons, for example, and then they will recruit a number of people for is usually called a risk prediction or risk management or risk assessment study, where the goal is the conclusive goal is to figure out if we can develop ways in which we can identify which individuals are of high risk inside the correctional system, right? Because these decisions eventually are really important, or this information is really important for decisions downstream, such as a parole board or a judge or something like that. They often have to make evaluations or make decisions on a person based on information about how high risk they believe they are, right? But anyway, that's the background. So what we often do is that we recruit a cohort of individuals to participate in this study. And then we gather all sorts of information about them, their age, gender, and so on, socioeconomic background, history of substance misuse, and so on. But one thing we also do is that we conduct a psychopathy assessment, right? So we want to figure out all of these people we include in our studies, which one of them are actually psychopathic and which ones are not, right? So now, once we have all this information gathered about these individuals, eventually these individuals will have to leave the prison when they have served their sentence, right? So eventually they will be let out back into society in some way or the other. Sometimes they're on probation, sometimes they're parole, sometimes they're just, out in society and trying to reintegrate, right? Now, what we then do as psychologists is that we, metaphorically, we stand and wait by the prison and see which one comes back in because they reoffended or something like that. Like, of course, a little bit more technical in reality. In reality, we have access to, the legal system's databases, so we can see which of these individuals who were in our study initially ended up recidivating, as we say. They ended up committing a new crime, right? So what we can do after, a follow-up period of, say, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 years is that we can take and start comparing. So those individuals with psychopathy versus those people without psychopathy, is there any difference in risk? Like, in other words, how large is the difference in the reconviction rate, for example, all right? Now, if you want to say that a person is extremely dangerous or extraordinarily dangerous or much more dangerous because they're a psychopath or have a psychopathy diagnosis, you want to make some claims about how large a difference do you think we would see when we compare these two groups, right? Now, you might want to say that the difference, if it really is true, the psychopathic persons are more dangerous than non-psychopathic persons, you should at least see a big difference in this group here in terms of their reconviction rates, right? Because if there's not, then like, if there's no difference, then there's just no difference, right? There's no difference in risk, right? So of course, it's all going to be a question of how big the difference is, right? Now, so we have conducted roughly somewhere around 200 and 230 of such studies, which is quite a lot. And we're talking about thousands of individuals who have been enrolled in these studies, right? And what we have found is that there is a difference between these two groups. The people with a psychopathy diagnosis are, on balance, more dangerous, if you will. The problem is just that difference is very underwhelming. It ranges from a small to a medium difference. This is statistical language now, and it really just tells you that yes, there is a difference, but it's not really great. Now, if you go in and you dive into these statistics, what we find is that what is really driving these differences, it might not actually be the diagnosis itself, but it might be the way that we're measuring it. So remember, we talked about the PCLR. So the PCLR consists of all sorts of trait items. So 20 in total. It could be something like, lack empathy, lack remorse, shallow affect, and so on. But it also includes things such as criminal versatility. In other words, have the person in the past committed many different types of crimes? It also includes such as revocation of conditional release. In other words, have the probation and parole system have difficulties with this person in the past, and so on. So now you start to see in the data what is really predicting this difference in risk is really just their past criminal behavior. So it's hard for us to tease apart what is actually making the prediction, right? Now, what some researchers have done is that they have said, okay, so let's just look at the psychopathic traits, like those that are like clearly like the ones that we associate with psychopathy, lack of empathy, lack of remorse, and all those things. And what we see when we compare that data, then so what you literally do is that you pool people in terms of how they score on these items instead. So you make different samples of different groups, right? What we see here is that the difference really gets substantially lowered. So in other words, there's not really much of a clear difference between these two groups, right? That's what we find.
Is there still a difference statistically?
Yeah, there is still a difference, but it is we're now down to levels where it starts to like it could also just be noise, right? So we usually have something we call confidence intervals in statistics. Not that it has to be too technical here, but sometimes we are like, okay, so if you see a small effect in a study, you can also often like say, I'm a little bit in doubt whether this is like is really like a clear signal here. Maybe it could just be noise, right? Now, I want to say that just to give the listeners just an idea of how small these differences are, even just on the raw PCLR score, like even if we don't like look into the details of the statistics. And picture this example here. Imagine that you are a forensic psychologist and you work inside a prison, right? And let's say the parole board asks you to make so we have this prisoner in our system, and his name is Fabio. And I am a psychologist now, and I have to go and make an assessment of Fabio to see how dangerous he is, right? So I give you a PCLR assessment, and you score high on this PCLR assessment, right? So what I can now do as a psychologist is I can go to the research on psychopathic persons, and I can look at it and say, okay, there is a small to medium elevation in risk here. Now let's translate that into my decision making as a forensic psychologist. If I go back to the parole board and say that Fabio is of relatively higher risk compared to a person who score lower, right? That will give the parole board like an idea that you are a relative higher risk. Now, according to the statistics that we have gathered from all these studies, that decision I have just made about you will be correct in roughly 66% of the cases you make. So imagine that I'm assessing, 3 Fabios that day. In 2 of those 3 cases, my assessment would be correct. It would actually be the case that that these 2 individuals are more dangerous, but not much, but they're slightly more dangerous. In the last case, though, I would be wrong. That's what that means. That's so in 2/3 of the times when you use this tool, you're actually going to be wrong in your assessment, right? Or in your description of the risk levels. So that's, when you set it up in false positive rates, because this would be equivalent to you're making the determination that the person is high risk, but it's actually false. They are not, right? Now you start to realize how problematic this becomes quickly, right? Because, they will make decisions about that third person. For example, they might not give him parole, right? But because they believe wrongly that they were of higher risk, right? So we're not so certain about it.
So what you're saying maybe is that there is a statistically significant difference, but the difference might not be so practically significant and relevant for decision making.
Yes, that is pretty much what we're finding in the research. That there is a difference. There is a meaningful difference, it seems, between psychopathic personality, but the difference is not very big, and therefore it's and there's also a lot of caveats to it. What we call moderating variables in statistics. So we are starting to realize that we probably shouldn't be that, we probably shouldn't characterize psychopathic persons as extremely dangerous, right? That's at least what that evidence shows, is that claim is not justified. We know that for sure today, right? And you can still, the paradox a little bit is also that the Psychopathy Checklist and psychopathy in general was supposed to select the worst of the worst, right? That's kind of what is embedded in that. And that we can say for sure, that's not what it's doing, right? So whatever it's doing, okay, we can talk about that. But if the claim is that it's supposed to select extremely dangerous individuals, well, that has been thoroughly falsified, I think, at this stage. You're simply just not doing that, right? So that's where we are, right? That the claim was that psychopathic individuals are very dangerous. That has not been substantiated by the empirical research, right? So I think we should keep the eye on the ball here, right? That's what the claim is: extreme dangerousness. That is not supported by data. End of story, right? Yeah.
Place. And also, let's move on to another idea about psychopathy. Another widespread idea is that psychopathy is essentially untreatable.
Mm.
Is this true?
The short answer is that no, it's not. It's a very strong claim. I just want to people have to realize how powerful a claim it is that there's nothing you can do, is untreatable, right? We don't really accept that for any mental health disorders in our system, right? We just don't accept that, right? For most mental health diagnosis, it's generally believed that you as a clinician, you have minimal things you can do. Like, so if a person shows up in your clinic with major depression, well, you can assist them and help them and care for them in all sorts of ways. But, whatever you do is never going to have or rarely going to have this profound impact. Like, for example, if you take a flu vaccine, or if you get medication for some known disease, right? Like, it's usually not that effective what we do in psychiatry in general. Now, having said that, um, we do have experiments now, or treatment studies, or treatment outcome studies, as we call them, where we enroll individuals with a psychopathy diagnosis, and then we measure all sorts of outcomes and see if we can impact that as a clinician. And what we find is that very commonly occurs, that we have some sort of seeming impact on a person's behavior. What we typically focus on in forensic settings is whether we can impact their level of recidivism after release from an institution, right? That's typically what we're interested in. So if you imagine you took two groups, one group who had psychopathy but did not receive treatment, and then one group who has psychopathy who did receive treatment, what we should find is that the treated group has lower levels of recidivism compared to the other group, right? If that's the outcome we want to kind of affect, right? And that is indeed also what we have found across quite a good number of studies at this point, right? So if you give a person with a psychopathy diagnosis support, care, in whatever ways that we can, in whatever limited ways we can, it seems to also have a positive impact, right? So again, the claim is, or the old claim was, that there's nothing you can do. That we can just brush aside as saying that's just false. Like, you can do something. Again, what you can do is probably minimal, but that goes for anything we do really in psychiatric settings. But you can indeed do something, yeah.
The effect size of the therapy effect in terms of effect size is comparable to the effect size of therapy in other disorders? Or
Yeah, so this is where things very quickly becomes tricky to compare, right? So it's for all sorts of reasons, but one of the main reasons is that the outcomes that we measure on a treatment study involving psychopathic persons is criminal recidivism, for example. But that's usually not what you compare, you look for in a major depression study, for example. So it's very difficult to compare these different treatment studies. What we can just say is that we observe that there's something you can do. We're not really good at dealing with it because there's been very little research in it, and just generally, when we enroll individuals more generally, as not necessarily psychopathic persons, but when we enroll people in rehabilitation treatment programs, we do find that we can help them in all sorts of ways. But what we can do for them, again, is we have minimal avenues to really make a profound impact, right? But simply, again, let's keep an eye on the ball here. The claim was that there's nothing you can do, right? That was the old claim from the 1990s. Very common to see that. But that we have found out we can just brush aside as saying that's just false, right? But of course, we shouldn't be too optimistic in terms of what we can do, right? But that goes for anything we do within the legal system, I would say, when it comes to rehabilitation and treatment more generally.
Since a lot of the problems are with the bold claims that have been made and they're weakly supported, someone might say like that the claims we are talking are just straw man. How would you respond to that?
So strawman fallacy is usually when I make somebody's claim very weak in my response to them, right? So I'm representing their view as very weak, and then I'm responding to that weak version of it, right? And this is really not what we're doing here. People back in the days in 1990s and also in the 2000s, they did indeed make these claims. Actually, they made them much stronger. Some even claim that if you try to treat a person with psychopathy, you're actually going to make them worse. That was a very common claim back in the 1990s and 2000. In fact, I recently did a study where we looked through expert testimonies in court cases in Canada. And what we found was that you still to this day see expert witnesses or psychiatrists say this about psychopathic persons, that they not only can you not treat them, but if you try, they will actually get worse. These are very powerful claims, right? And there are straightforward ways of testing them empirically. And what I can just say is that when we go test them empirically, it just simply doesn't hold up. And it would also be extremely surprising if it did hold up, I just want to say, because this is usually not how human beings behave, right? Human beings generally don't want to be in prison. It might come as a surprise to people. I don't think it does. I'd be facetious here, obviously. But even if you had a psychopathy diagnosis, surely, and it's just even if we assumed that psychopathy is this type of diagnosis that really exists and everything we say about it is more or less true, the treatment claim seems to just still be like on another level of being far-fetched, because surely a psychopathic person is able to appreciate that they don't want to end up in prison again. And if they see a psychiatrist that has all sorts of help to offer in terms of them not going back to prison, it seems like they should be rational enough to actually see that that's going to help them on that pathway, right? And therefore get them, on, if all things being the same, it should get them on a better path in life, right? It seems to be a strange claim that it should make them worse, right? There seems to, again, so we would have been very surprised if we have found that, I would say, but we haven't. So yeah.
Go on. So another very common view about psychopathy, I think this is very common, is that psychopathic individuals lack moral, psychological capacities like empathy or the capacity to make moral judgments. What do you have to say about this idea?
Yeah, so this is one of the oldest claims, if not the oldest claim about psychopathy. It dates back to how the diagnostic label or the disorder itself was defined, actually. So if we go back to the first iteration I've been able to find from a scientist, is based all the way back to 1786. So it's more than 200 years old. And this was an American American physician, his name was Benjamin Rush, who proposed the disorder. He didn't call it psychopathy back then. He'd used a different label. First, he used a label called anomia, and then later he used moral derangement. So here you can already see that this idea of morality was implicated in just even in the label itself, right? It later in England became moral insanity. And then later on again, eventually it turned to psychopathic inferiorities, and it became psychopathy, and then we have the contemporary label, right? But if we go back to this idea more about having moral incapacities associated with psychopathy, Benjamin Rush put it this way. He said back in the 1700s, he said that this disorder he wanted to conceptualize or talk about had implications on an individual's moral faculty. So back in the 1700s and 1800s, for that matter, it was widely believed that the human mind was compartmentalized into having there was different faculties, we said, that was in charge of different types of behaviors and belief systems and so on, right? So we believed back then that the brain or the mind had a faculty that was called the moral faculty, and that was what was responsible for our moral behavior, right? So when we were being good people, it's because we had a very strong moral faculty. So this was almost like a physiological idea, if you will. Now, Benjamin Rush was proposing that this faculty could be diseased. So the logic goes along the following line. If you have a disease in your moral faculty, you no longer can tell the difference between right and wrong, for example. And therefore, if you can't tell the difference between right and wrong, you also will end up doing wrong things more commonly. Like that's just going to be something that you end up in, right? So that was his explanation of this disorder. This is of course, it's just ludicrous, basically. But we don't believe that the mind is divided into faculties and then they can be discretely diseased in this way, right? That's just not something we believed. So in contemporary iterations of this idea, it has become a little bit more sophisticated, right? So we see when we get into the 1900s, we see that people started talking about that, psychopaths have shallow emotions, or they have no emotions at all. And they connected to this idea that, it seems our moral behavior is often driven by emotions. So if you don't have any emotions, you also can't care for anything because care is usually seen as an emotional construct, right? You also cannot empathize with an individual and so on and so forth, right? You don't feel remorse. You don't have a conscience. So we see book titles such as Robert Hare's famous book, Without Conscience, right? That's the title of the book from 1993. And he's just claiming psychopaths don't have emotions, therefore they have no conscience. So when they go out and let's just say that I need money today and I'm a psychopath, I'll just go rob a bank and I'm not going to feel bad about it, right? I don't understand what this, why people are so upset about this. I don't understand morality. That was Robert Hare's kind of characterization of the situation. So they would use more nuanced ideas that psychopathic person were morally colorblind, they would say. So they know that, Rasmus and Fabio has certain rules that they go by in their everyday lives. They have these moral rules, and they can read that and they can hear you say that you think this is wrong, this is right, this is wrong, and so on. They just don't understand what the big deal is. That was Robert Hare's claim, right? So you feel bad when you morally transgress, but a psychopath won't, right? That was the idea. And it's not because they just didn't feel particularly bad about that particular thing. It's that they don't have the capacity. They are without conscience, right? That's the claim, right? Now, so we can go test that, luckily, right? So we don't have to speculate and conceptualize and theorize and so on. We can just go test it, right? So we can just take individuals with a psychopathy diagnosis, and then we can give them all sorts of tests, right? So if they really have no emotions, well, we can go test their emotions. We actually do have pretty good understanding of, when a person is emoting, what sort of, different nervous systems are activated and so on. So we can go test that. We can also do empathy tests, for example. So there are empathy tests out there that we can administer. They're not perfect. They're not a fine-grained measure of empathy, but at least if the claim is that you have no empathy, it's a reasonable expectation that you would ping out very differently on a test like that compared to other people, right? We can also just ask individuals questions about morality. You know, if we are interviewed about morality, we will give all sorts of ordinary responses, right? We can see that when we talk about morality, and if you ask a person, normal, random person about, is it wrong to murder? Most people would say yes, right? And if you ask them why, most people will give you like maybe a response about, oh, it's because, you're violating their rights, it's harmful, and so on, right? But if you don't know what morality is, you might expect that people would give like very different answers to these questions, right? So long story short, we have done probably a little bit more than 100 of these different types of studies, empathy studies, emotion studies, moral, psychological studies, and so on. And we have just never been able to really identify these extreme difficulties that people like Benjamin Rush and Robert Hare eventually talked about. It's just simply not the case. So again, the claim is that they have profound difficulties with moral psychology. That's a claim, an empirical claim. When we go test it, we just don't find that. And one example I can give just briefly is that from the empathy research literature, right? So there's one type of empathy that we usually call cognitive empathy. And that's the idea that I can, I can gauge another person's emotional states by just looking at them without them telling me, right? So say, Fabio, you came into my office one day and you're super sad. I might be able to instantly tell that you're sad, even though that you haven't actually told me, right? Now, so if a person has no emotions or has the incapacity to empathize, you would expect that they get this wrong all the time. So they cannot read your emotions. If you go into the idea is if you walked into a psychopath's office one day and you were really sad, they would have no clue that you're sad, right? So luckily, we can actually just go test that, right? Because we can just show pictures of people who are sad, for example, or angry or happy or whatever. And we can ask people with a psychopathy diagnosis, what emotion is this person feeling, right? Or show a video or something like that, right? And then see if they get it wrong. And we have done that. We have done that actually. In fact, around 37 types of different studies have done that. And the listeners can probably sense there's a pattern here. But what we find is just that there's no differences. There's no meaningful differences between psychopathic persons and non-psychopathic.
If I'm not wrong, you did like a systematic review on the topic.
Yeah, my research group did a systematic review a couple of years ago on all that research, right? And what we found, just briefly, is that it's mostly just null findings. To people who are not keyed in on what a null finding mean, it just means that, for example, if you take two groups, you're not able to detect any like statistical differences between them, right? That's a null finding. Just below, I can't remember the exact percentage, but I think we found that the null ratio, so the percentage or the number of tests that are actually null findings, is around 90%. So every time we have tested, in 90% of the cases is null findings. Now, some listener might be saying, oh, so what about the last 10 times? Well, then, psychologists did find some differences. But, you have to understand a little bit about psychological research. We often just find spurious things just by coincidence because the data sets can be messy and things like that. And in these last 10% of findings that where we did find differences, they were actually in both directions. Sometimes the people with psychopathy diagnosis had better emotion recognition capabilities compared to not. So, the general consensus when you find, weak results here and there as a psychologist is just to say this is probably just noise, right? This is not indicative of anything like generalizable to a population. It's just like an artifact of our. So we did all sorts of other tests to test that, whether it's just an artifact of noise, and that is indeed also what we found, right? So So, but I'm not going to go into these details. But generally, when you only find a few results as a psychologist, we generally don't tend that to be a meaningful discovery, right?
I'm wondering if the outcome measure in your review was just like cognitive empathy or also emotional empathy.
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the empathy research in this domain is usually, I just mentioned cognitive empathy, but there's also the other type of empathy that people often address, right, which is emotional, or it's also called affective empathy. This is a type of empathy where if you, let's take the example where you, Fabio, come into my office and you're feeling really sad, not only am I able to read your sadness without you telling me that you're sad, that's cognitive empathy, but I might also start feeling sad myself. That's usually called affective or emotional empathy, right? So this is a little bit more tricky to test in an experimental setup, but people have actually done that in roughly also, I think it was 33 different studies that have tested this. And the tests are not as powerful, in my own opinion, but they generally rely on something called a self-report empathy assessment. So they will ask questions such as, if your friend feels really sad, would you also start feeling sad, right? Like, and you have to say to what degree you agree with this, right? They can also like be a little bit more sophisticated, such as you can watch a video where a person is being harmed, for example, and then you can answer self-report. How did this make you feel, for example? So there's all sorts of versions of these tests, right? And the reason why they're not so powerful is that we can rarely recreate a powerful example in an experimental setting. We're not allowed to, for example, really hurt people in an experimental setting and measure how people feel, right? So they're not that powerful. But what we find is exactly the same pattern as from cognitive empathy. It's just like an ocean of null findings and then a few spurious findings here and there. Yeah. So again, there's really just not any evidence to suggest that psychopathic persons have difficulties with this.
Okay, thank you. Let's move on to another common idea, which is the view that psychopathy is fundamentally a biological condition in the sense that we have clear genetic or neurobiological markers on psychopathy. Uh,
Yeah.
what do you
So
have to say about this?
yeah, so it's this is again a claim that goes very far back, so even with Benjamin Rush in 1700s, he was actually claiming that this was a disease. It was like a physiological disease, right? So and we don't have to talk more about what he said about that, but if we fast forward to like contemporary times, researchers have tended to hypothesize. So this is very hypothetical stuff, right? Where people like, oh, I think this might have some genetic components. This might have some neurological components and so on. So we can go test that again in exactly the same way, right? So we can take individuals who has a psychopathy diagnosis, and then we can test them in all sorts of ways, right? We can look at their genetic makeup, see if we can find any genetic markers. So we can look at neurochemistry, we can look at neurological structures of your brain, your functional patterns, and so on. So researchers have done that in a quite broad way, tested all sorts of things, and something that might be most relevant because it's also perhaps the most powerful technology, and we would assume that this type of technology would be able to detect something if it existed. And that's from the MRI neuroimaging research. So magnetic resonance imaging, right? Is broadly considered to be the most powerful neuroimaging technology we have. It's not perfect. It's not like great in any way. There are all sorts of limitations to it, but at least it's the powerful stuff we have available, right? And we have roughly around just below 100 such studies where we have taken psychopathic persons, thrown them into an MRI scanner and then, scan the structure of their brain or scan them while they were doing some sort of cognitive task, right? To see if there are any differences in their brain compared to other people. And again, the pattern is the same thing. When we start aggregating the findings from all these studies, if we start to see a pattern where most of it, the vast majority of results are null findings, and then there's like sporadic findings here and there, right? Especially with something like neuroimaging research, we have to be very careful with sporadic findings, because here they are very vulnerable to what you call confounding variables. So, because the brain is such a complex organ, you're almost certain to find something when you do an experiment, because, we can enroll people in an experiment, but, we don't know much about their past. Maybe they had a concussion when they were 6 years old, right? That's going to show up in your brain scan, but you're not going to be able to control for it, because people usually can't remember that, right? And maybe the person played a lot of football, not the real football, but the American style, and had, like all sorts of minor trauma to their head. They're not gonna be able to know that when you put a person into a scanner. Maybe in forensic settings, the person has a substance misuse disorder, that they are actually, currently taking drugs, but they're not going to tell you, because, they're not going to tell the experimenter that they're on drugs, right? That's going to ping out on your study also. So to make a long story short, I have been involved in these systematic reviews of all this research, and what we find is usually we find somewhere between 70 and 85% null findings. In other words, that we don't find any differences. But then there's these 15 to 20%, or in some research domains, up to 30% significant findings. These are usually scattered all over the place of the brain. There's no clear patterns, and we're also not clear whether these are just confounding variables, these effects that are created by confounding variables. But one key message here is that something we did in one review study we took all these functional neuroimaging studies, and then we looked for whether there was any replicated findings, right? So if you have one study that's found a signal in some area of the brain, we want to see if there's a study that used the same method and also found the same, reproduced the effect. And that has not happened yet. So every time we have a replication attempt, it just doesn't replicate, right? So we have a situation now where it's mostly null findings, and it's also nothing that is replicated. To a neurologist or a neuroscientist, that's pretty strong evidence to suggest there's probably not anything there, right? Of course, maybe we'll discover something in the future. That's always the possibility, but so far we haven't discovered anything that is like robust evidence to suggest that psychopathy is a biological, has any biological markers or causalities, if you will.
Okay. Nice. Thank you. Do you think there are other ideas that we need to debunk, or
I think a little bit can be said about, it has often been claimed, that we kind of have like a good idea of what is causing psychopathy more generally, what is driving individuals with psychopathy. It has been proposed that they have bad impulse control. It's also been proposed that they have no emotions. That is what's driving it. And I just want to briefly say that we have a
causal explanation? So
it has like an overarching causal explanation. We look for that also in the brain, but it could be elsewhere, right? So people are just saying, oh, we have like in the sciences, we say we have a good theory of psychopathy, meaning that we have a good explanation of it. Now, so two leading explanations is that it's actually an impulse control problem. So people have really bad executive functions, and that is what you're seeing as a clinician. So when a person is doing bad things, not caring and so on, they're actually just like very impulsive, right? The other explanation is that they don't have any emotions. That was Robert Hare's old claim, right? And I just want to say that we have tested these two explanations quite significantly. And these explanations have just not been corroborated, as you would say, as a scientist. there's just not much evidence to suggest they make much sense. So in short, when you go out and you test individuals with psychopathy diagnosis, what you find is that they have emotional reaction patterns, for example, just like any other human being, right? Which of course just like falsifies this idea that they have no emotions, right? So I just want to say that's like it's not some research we often talk much about, but that research is important from a scientific standpoint. And again, it's also important to observe here that research has just not panned out the way we thought it would. It was the way we hypothesized, right?
Okay, thank you. So all this brings us to your central claim. You describe psychopathy as the zombie idea, a concept that survives despite weak empirical support. Now I'm wondering, when we fail to find evidence for something, uh, how should we react? Uh, do you think it is reasonable, at least in this case, to move from the absence of evidence to the evidence of absence? I mean, because someone might say, "Well, we don't have the right tools to measure, like, I don't know, emotional empathy, or the PCL is not a good tool to
Yeah.
screen those individuals, and so we have like a methodological problem. We cannot capture the phenomenon." I would respond to that.
I mean, I think those are, this is the core question, right? So currently we have a situation in the field where virtually everything we have tried to study about psychopathy has either not turned out the way we hypothesized or believed that it would turn out, or it has even falsified many of the claims that we have made, right? We have quite powerful evidence to falsify some of the claims, right? So, for example, if you claim that psychopathy cannot be treated, these individuals cannot benefit from help, and then they do in fact benefit from help, well, then of course it falsifies that claim, right? But let's leave it by that, right? So what explains this lack of progress in the research field? That's maybe the better way to frame it, right? So why is it that we're not finding this evidence of these things that we are claiming about these individuals? Well, there are probably many potential explanations for this shortcoming, for this lack of progress, right? And there are all sorts of things I could think of, but there are at least like two central ones, right? The one is that, man, behavioral science and mental health research is just really, really difficult. So when you're seeing that the results are not pinging out the way that you had imagined, it's just an expression of how difficult it is to study something like this, right? And we should just continue studying, even like one day when our methods become more sophisticated, our technology becomes more sophisticated, then one day we will actually find evidence of this, right? And I'm fully on board with that. Like personally, I say that go ahead, please be my guest. Go ahead and study more. Like maybe we will indeed find something, right? But I have all sorts of reasons why I don't necessarily think it's like a fully rational conclusion. I think I can see a lot of problems with it, and one is that you are saying that everything we do is not sophisticated enough in terms of research methods. You're kind of assuming that. I don't think that's true, actually. I do think that, for example, MRI research can be a very powerful tool. I also just think that, if like in terms of measuring emotions or people's empathy levels and so on, yeah, they are imperfect, but you are claiming something that is really powerful. And I think our methods are, powerful enough at least to like go out and test those claims. So the way I usually say to my students is that, look, we're not searching for a needle in a haystack. If you're claiming these individuals, psychopathic person, have all these very extreme psychological attributes, such as no emotions, have no empathy, and extremely dangerous and all that stuff. We are sophisticated enough in the behavioral sciences to test such claims. Like, but if your claim was that, oh no, they have very, very small and subtle empathy incapacities. Okay, well, that is not the claim, but if that was the claim, then yes, then I would agree that maybe our methods are not sophisticated enough. We maybe our samples have been too small and so on, right? But I just want to emphasize that's not what we're claiming, right? We're not searching for a needle in a haystack here. Now, the other counter argument that I sometimes hear is that methods are fine. There's nothing wrong with that. But what is going on here is that all this research that you're describing, it's based on the PCLR, right? So you have literally gone in and you have used the PCLR scale to select your samples. And these individuals who make that argument are usually like very strongly critical about the PCLR. What they usually believe is that the PCLR does not select the truly psychopathic persons, right? So what ends up happening in this part of the story is that the samples you end up with, let's just say that you had a sample of 100 individuals. The samples might contain, 20 truly psychopathic persons, but then 80 persons who weren't, right? So once you start testing that sample, you're going to get a lot of messy data. So that's one explanation, right? And I think that's a perfectly reasonable explanation, and it makes sense. You cannot deny that it makes sense, right? I just want to say quickly that there's also reasons why you might not be convinced by it. One reason is, for example, that, well, you can kind of always say that about any study, right? So now you're kind of creating a barricade for people who want to falsify things. You can always say, no, there's a sampling problem. No, like every time you're not finding the results that are counter to what you expect, you can always say there was a sampling problem, right? Sometimes it will be, and sometimes it won't, but you can always say it, right? Now that's one issue, but the overarching and perhaps most powerful issue with this explanation is that it's just simply not true that the PCLR is not selecting the type of individuals people have in mind when they say psychopathy, right? There's a broad, or was at least in the 1990s and 2000s, especially a broad consensus that when we say psychopathy, we are referring to a certain like prototype of individual in the legal system, particularly, that represent in all sorts of ways, right? And the PCLR is just a way of conceptualizing that and helping you to identify these individuals, right? So the PCLR is identifying individuals that clinicians, believed are the psychopathic persons, right? Now, what you're suggesting now, if you want to say that there's a problem with the PCLR, is that you're also suggesting we should somehow we should reconceptualize psychopathy, right? And that's fine if that's what you want to do. A lot of people want to do that. But now you're really creating a big hot mess because we have to start all over now. And I'm not sure you're going to find consensus.
You're changing the subject in a sense.
In a sense, you are, right? And that's fine. Maybe we have to change the subject. But the problem is that psychiatric research or mental health research more broadly, it always starts from a consensus place, right? So it starts with clinicians saying, there are these individuals in our clinics. They represent with all sorts of symptoms that we think go together. So, for example, people came into our clinics, back in, the 30s, 40s, and 50s, and were like, they seem to just be super sad, low emotions, and they, for no apparent reason. And eventually, we start to say, this might be depression, major depression. So we gave it the label major depression. That label is just telling you that clinicians agree that there is a clinical stereotype or prototype that we give the label major depression, right? It's the same thing that happened with psychopathy. There are these individuals usually in our forensic clinical settings that are very, they seem to not care about morality and so on, and then we gave them that label, and then we developed tools and how to identify them, assist clinician identifying them. this explanation for the lack of progress we're now talking about suggests that we should completely rethink all that, right? And that's fine. Maybe we have to, but we have to start all over again, right? So I think a lot of people, they underdetermine how consequential such an explanation really is, right? And also also how controversial it actually is at the end of the day, because it's controversial because it goes against consensus, right? And maybe it's the right thing, but
also what it was trying to say is that this strategy doesn't do anything to save the current concept. And you can say that the current concept is just its zombie idea. So that might be a different concept than psychopathy.
Yeah. So that's my approach, right? Or something that I've been thinking carefully about the last couple of years or 5 years or something like that. Like, I think that what might be going on here is that psychopathy could be a zombie idea. So what is in that concept of a zombie idea is that, first of all, people are fascinated by the idea. They find it intuitively appealing. So clinicians look at these patients that comes into their clinics, and then they're like, there's something different about these individuals, psychopathy. Then they come up with this label, right? And this label is very sticky. A lot of people think it makes sense, right? So all these claims that are associated with it, people think that makes sense. Clinicians, forensic psychiatrists, forensic psychologists, even lay people are fascinated by it and so on. So it kind of like sticks and is very intuitively appealing. But the problem is that there is no such thing as psychopathy in the way we conceptualize it. That thing does not exist. We are wrong, in other words, with how we're describing it. But still, so the idea is dead, but it's very infectious, just like a zombie, right? That's kind of the analogy here. We can talk a little bit more if you want about like what goes into that idea itself. But I just want to say that this is not the first time in psychiatry this has happened, right? So this has occurred before, where psychiatrists, they had a label, they had a theory, they have all sorts of like ideas about this construct they're talking about them. And, a few things come to mind, such as hysteria or multiple personality disorder, for example. Here, clinicians were talking about real patients that they think represented with like a certain behavioral style and some symptoms and so on. And then they came up with a label and some theories and so on that conclusively were wrong, right? But they continued doing their work for decades until they realized they were wrong, and then they kind of like fell apart. So I think something like this might be at play with psychopathy, that these patients are real that we're talking about. It's just they are not the way that we are describing them, right?
Could you say a little bit more about your argument to defend this claim that psychopathy is just a zombie idea?
Yeah. So first of all, I want to say that if it's true what I'm saying, and it might very well be that it's not true. Okay, I could be mistaken as well, right? But if it's true what I'm saying, that it's a zombie idea, that we're simply just mistaken about what we're saying. In other words, that would explain why we're not making progress in the research, because we're studying something that doesn't exist, actually, right? That would make sense why we're not finding any evidentiary support for what we're saying, right? So it's a very powerful explanation to account for what we're observing in the research field. I just want to say that. So whether my explanation, the zombie idea explanation, ends up being true or not, and we still have to explain why we're not making progress, right? So my idea is just to give an attempt of trying to make sense of this, right? Now, so what ends up happening when you're studying a zombie idea is that you are somehow just blinded by that fact, right? You just cannot, as a researcher, you don't entertain this idea that maybe what you're studying doesn't really it's just not the way it is, right? So just to give you some analogies, maybe that's helpful, right? So let's take a disorder like multiple personality disorder. because it has a very similar history that I see compared to psychopathy. It was something that is very often forgotten about psychopathy. And I think this is actually some of the more appealing aspects of my idea here, or my proposal that psychopathy is zombie. Psychopathy was seen as a very controversial disorder back in the 1980s and the times before that. Like, most clinicians and most researchers did not think that this was a real phenomenon. Okay, so they were very skeptical about the few psychiatrists who did insist that it was a real disorder. What happened all of a sudden in the 1990s is that this research field explodes. So you see a huge increase in the research output. And so, in other words, more and more researchers goes, like, very quickly, joins the research team, metaphorically speaking, or jumps on board the ship, right? And this thing takes off very quickly. It goes enormously quick. So this happens in the late 1990s and 2000s. Similar things happen to multiple personality disorder. So multiple personality disorder is now a discarded diagnosis. It has been renamed and redefined into something today called dissociative identity disorder, which is very different from how it was conceptualized back in the days. But multiple personality disorder was this idea that individuals could have several separate personal identities living inside of them. And these identities would not have any recollection, memory, association with each other, right? So one day you could wake up as Fabio, but another day you could wake up as Paul, the neuroscientist, and another day as Susan, the promiscuous person working at, downtown or something, like all sorts of really, like, it was like literally a crazy idea, right? This is not a real thing, right? Like, people do not have several personalities inside them, right? But psychiatrists were arguing that this phenomenon was indeed real. And of course, what was happening was that they had patients that came into them, and some of them may be pretending that they had several personalities. Okay, we know that for a fact. We have all sorts of evidence to suggest that some people were just lying about that, some clinicians, right? So psychiatrists here were just fooled by this phenomenon, right? But many a patient might also just have had what we call dissociative symptoms, and that is like it's like a category of psychiatric symptoms where you have like disruptions to memory. You have disruptions to identity. Sometimes you have difficulty like self-identifying. So you don't know who you are. It's a very hard thing to wrap your mind around. Some of them might have also had like schizophrenic symptoms, so be delusional and have hallucinations and things like that, hearing voices. So they would frame that as, oh, it's my different personalities speaking to each other. No, it's not. You're delusion. You have hallucinations, right? But all being said was that we came up with this disorder, this label, to try to make sense of something that was in front of us. But this label and this way we would describe it was simply just wrong, right? Okay, so go back to psychopathy. I think I'm seeing something similar here. Those people who are really wedded to this idea of psychopathy, they are encountering individuals in our legal system, for example, who seem to have no emotions, no empathy, and all sorts of things. The problem is that they are probably just wrong about that, right? They do actually have capacity to empathize. They just don't exert it. They might have, very vivid and normal emotions. They just don't show you. All sorts of things we could say, right? But you might also just be observing like other types or nuances of other disorders in these patients, but you're falsely describing it as something to do with psychopathy, right? So this is often something that we observe when we take some of the most stereotypical and iconic cases of psychopathy, like serial killers are often a theme that is brought up, which is actually not very accurate, because most serial killers do not fit the psychopathy criteria, is a common myth. most serial killers are heavily users of substance misuse, often have very, very severe mental illnesses, and also have sometimes paired with all sorts of paraphilia, such as like sadistic sexual urges and so on. But anyway, leave that aside. Let's take a very iconic case like Ted Bundy, right? Are you familiar with the serial killer Ted Bundy, right?
Yeah.
So Ted Bundy was this seemingly normal person. Like he just didn't seem to have any emotional care for anyone, and he went out and became a serial killer, right? He killed we don't really know how many people he killed, but probably 3 dozens of people or something like that, including children. Now, it is very normal to describe Ted Bundy as a quintessential psychopath, right? Because here you have a person that seems to be normal cognitive capabilities, but just completely, devoid of any moral resonance with other people, right? The problem is with that description of Ted Bundy is that once you start digging into his past and his, profile a little bit more, you very quickly realize that the story is much more complicated. But we don't like to talk about that in pop culture, especially. We would like to portray him as, a psychopath. But once you really start to dig into Ted Bundy's past, you will realize that you're probably dealing with a person who is deluded. So he has delusions. He might even have had hallucinations also. So he's severely mentally ill. He has a substance misuse problem with alcoholism and maybe other drugs. We don't know for sure. He also has like very violent sexual urges that he's actually addressing occasionally, indirectly, not directly, to some of his family members. So his family members knows that there's something off, that he's not feeling well. So once you start to like look at all these things, right, all this evidence, you start to realize that maybe he's not. Maybe we can make sense of Ted Bundy through other means. We don't need the concept of psychopathy to make sense of a person like that, right? That is essentially what I mean by it being a zombie idea. I'm not denying that there is a phenomenon. No, there is. What I'm saying is that we are wrong about how we are characterizing it, right? We are mistaken. And that is what is explaining the lack of progress in the field, right? The tragedy with zombie ideas, just a final note here, Fabio, sorry. The tragedy with zombie ideas, if you will, from a scientific standpoint, is really that people don't realize that it's a zombie idea. I mean, that's what makes it a zombie idea, is that you are not aware. It keeps infecting future generations. And the tragedy is the consequence of that is that we keep wasting resources on this research. Resources that could have gone to other things, right? We don't have infinite research resources, so we shouldn't waste them, right? But when we have something like a zombie idea that flourishes in a field, it's a time and resource suck, right? And this is a huge problem, of course, for all sorts of reasons.
Sure. And in fact, I wanted to ask, if the concept of psychopathy is flawed, what are the implications for psychology or criminal justice, clinical practice?
Yeah, so I think this is a hugely important question, right? There are, as you correctly noticed, there seem to be two types of implications we can talk about. We can talk about the implications for the sciences, of course. Whenever we're wrong in the sciences, that has an immediate impact on, how did this affect educational systems? How did it impact the knowledge creation we are working on in the science, right? And that's a separate issue. And of course, when we're wrong, we're just wrong, right? And it has all sorts of like it means that, textbooks have to be rewritten. We have to really rethink how we're doing our courses to students. We have to readjust everything we thought. That just always happen. Every time we scientists are wrong, which happens quite a lot, by the way. That's kind of the purpose of the scientific method, is to figure out where we're wrong, right? We have to root out the errors in our belief systems. That's what we're doing as scientists. So that's all good. And whenever we discover an error, we just have to resettle, right? In 1910s, 20s, physicists discovered that Newtonian physics were not the way to go because of a person named Albert Einstein, right? And then, it took some years to readjust, and eventually, educational materials were rewritten, and something like that also has to take place if we one day arrive at the consensus that psychopathy was indeed a zombie idea. I'm not saying that we have arrived there yet, because, as I mentioned, I could be wrong, right? But maybe we will one day, and then that has to be adjusted. Now, you also mentioned a separate concern, and that is, of course, the criminal justice implications, right? Because, and this has really been the focus of my research, and the motivation for my research, because whether you think psychopathy is real or not, that is one issue. But also, all these claims we made about psychopathy and psychopathic persons, these claims are still working inside our criminal justice system. They're still impacting real people's lives. So our imaginary character, Fabio here, who has committed a crime, he goes through the legal system.
I'm a good guy, though.
So you go through the legal system. Sorry for
the interruption.
That's fine. You go through the legal system, and if you have that label, that diagnostic label, psychopath, on you, I can assure you there's going to be some decisions made about you that is not going to be in your favor, just because of that label alone, and because of the beliefs that are associated with that label, right? Now, those beliefs are wrong. We don't have empirical evidence to suggest that they're justified, but that doesn't change that they are indeed impacting your life. Because you have a reduced chance of parole. You have increased chance of being placed in high risk security facilities. You have lower chance of being offered probation instead of a prison sentence, and so on and so forth. All sorts of, there are very grave influences in North America, such as this being used for juvenile transfers, transferring juvenile offenders into the adult system. And it's being used in capital sentencing to argue that a person should have a death penalty instead of a life without parole, for example. So it has all sorts of enormous consequences for individuals, right? And now, that is in of itself wrong, even if psychopathy is not a zombie idea, because we still don't have evidence of these claims that we're making about psychopathy. Yet it is making an impact. But this situation gets even further amplified. I'm assuming you can see here, if we're actually fundamentally wrong about psychopathy. Now we're even not only are we using a diagnosis in the wrong way, but we're actually using a bunk diagnosis now, right? So this, of course, will also have implications there. Much of my work, of course, have been to show that whether you believe psychopathy is real or not, that still doesn't change the fact that we are negatively impacting people's lives in an unjustified manner right now in the legal system. And you might also ask as a follow-up question, okay, so how many people are we talking about? We might be talking about dozens or maybe even hundreds of thousands of individuals in North America alone that are impacted by this diagnosis, right? And I have often argued that I think this is the harm that is creating has an emergency level scale, right? People are just not seeing it because there's not been much attention thrown at this, right? So this is really part of the core of the work that I'm doing, trying to get people to realize that this is actually quite problematic what we're doing, right?
So what should we do in practice, in your opinion?
We should stop using this, and we simply just a full stop. That would be my best recommendation. Like, stop using psychopathy in the legal system. It's there's all sorts of reasons why, or additional reasons I could highlight. But first of all, if you're committed to evidence-based practices, as it's called, which all North American practitioners are, and I believe all practitioners in Europe, for that matter, are also committed to evidence-based practices, right? That means that you need to have some, that usually implies that you need to have some scientific empirical evidence to back your decision-making, right? And when you're using a concept or a diagnosis like psychopathy, it trivially follows from the research record that you don't have evidence or support to use this diagnosis, right? That's what I have just outlined. Now, you can use it maybe in all sorts of like confined ways, but it comes with enormous risk, right? Because the legal decision making the legal system is a very complicated system. So when you as a psychologist goes in and you give, again, Fabio a PCLR assessment, for example, that is not something that you as a psychologist is going to be the only user of, right? You're going to write that into Fabio's file records that he has a psychopathy assessment score this high and so on. And any person in the system can use that information. In other words, they can misuse that information, right? So when you might make an argument that you can use a PCLR assessment for during risk assessment purposes or the risk assessment procedures, but you cannot guarantee that a person down the line is not going to misuse that information, right? But here's also an additional complication. Since risk assessment purposes appears to be the only real justified way you could use a PCLR assessment, you're actually not really justified in doing it because there are better tools for assessing risk. So if you're committed to evidence-based practices, you should use the best available evidence to inform your practices, and the PCLR is just not going to be part of that. It's just completely uncontroversial to suggest, by the way, because we know from the research that it's not a very impressive risk assessment tool, paradoxically, but it's nevertheless the truth, right? So yeah, I really don't see any bright future for this stuff in the legal system. I haven't even started talking about the ethical issues that are implied here, but I think there's also some ethical conversation we should start having about what are you even doing as a clinician, giving this diagnostic label to a person. Are you helping them? Doesn't seem like it. Are you harming them? Yeah, it seems like you are. Are they consenting to this assessment? Doesn't seem like they would. What are we doing? This goes against the grain of all our ethical commitments as caretakers, right?
Okay, very nice. Thank you. And I want to ask one last thing. This is a more general question. But if I'm not wrong, you have a background in philosophy. So my question is, uh, in your opinion, what's the role of philosophy in psychology, in psychological science, or in science in general? Because some people just think that philosophy is BS. We don't need philosophy. So what's your take on that?
That's a very common experience, by the way. No, I mean, all all jokes aside, it's my background is in philosophy of science more specifically. So and there's a lot of stuff going on in the sciences that are actually philosophical questions. So I like to divide philosophical questions and the way what philosophers do into dealing with questions where we don't have any readily discoverable or empirical answers to them, right? So a lot of stuff we do in the sciences do not necessarily allow itself to an empirical answer. So you're really just like dealing with a philosophical question. Like, for example, how do you weigh evidence? Like when do you say that a theory has been corroborated satisfactorily? When do you say it has been falsified? Well, you're not going to discover that answer through studying it empirically. You kind of just have to really analyze it rationally and interrogate that question and reach some consensus, right? So this is really what I've specialized in trying to like deal with all these questions. When can we say we have knowledge about something? When can we say we don't? And so on. So, what you eventually have to do is to make up some rules and how do you make inferences from research, my specialty is really to look at a large pool of very complex evidence and try to come up with some heuristics, so some rules, inference rules for what conclusions can we draw from this evidence, right? And when should we say we're satisfied with the evidence base, and when should we say that we're not satisfied with the evidence base, right? So yeah, I think philosophers have a huge role to play here, and it's not just something I'm saying. You're actually seeing it in the sciences much more profoundly these days, that philosophers are taking that active role and participating in fields like this, and of course myself being just one example of that. But yeah, philosophy also has a lot of stuff that they do that is not going to be beneficial for the sciences, but at least some of what we do will.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much. In conclusion, is there anything you'd like to mention or promote? Maybe your book, your current work?
Yeah, I mean, if people are interested in this stuff, I encourage them to check out my book, Psychopathy Unmasked: The Rise and Fall of a Dangerous Diagnosis. It can be purchased wherever books are being sold, but I'm sure your local library might also have a copy or e-version of it that you can browse through. I just want to say that I think this is an enormously complicated topic to study, and there's a lot of moving parts, and I just want to express some humility. I might not sound very humble when I talk about my work. So as if everything is settled. I don't think everything is settled. I try to do my best in not trying to be fooled by the evidence I'm looking at. Yeah, I think these are fascinating, but also very difficult questions. I hope that kind of came across in what I was telling here. But I would also hear if people have any questions, they're also more than welcome to email me or reach out in any way.
So thank you very much again for the conversation. It was very interesting. And thanks everyone for watching. See you soon.
Thank you for having me. Thanks for having me.